Super, and we're live. Very good. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, how are you doing?
I am doing pretty good. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good. How's the weather where you are?
I am in Earlsfield, so that's southwest London, and it's a little bit grey today, actually, a little bit grey.
It's been like that since the whole of 2026, right?
I think we had one brief moment of spring yesterday where
Yeah.
everyone was outside.
Nice. Well, we'll give it just a couple of minutes for folks to join. Welcome to all the people who are tuning in from wherever you are. I hope your weather is better than where Rachel and I are. I'm also south of London and it is grey. It's not raining, which makes a nice change, but it's pretty grey outside. For those eagle-eyed viewers out there, you may notice I am not Daniel Bryant. So normally for the Syntasso webinar, Daniel hosts and does an excellent job. Sadly, poor Daniel actually had to have his wisdom teeth removed this week. So he's been in surgery. We've heard from him. He's doing well, but he's in recovery right now. In fact, he's probably watching. So no pressure, no pressure. But there's no chance I'll be as smooth as Daniel. So sorry, Daniel, to not be as good as you. But we'll just have to muddle on and do our best. So sending positive vibes to Daniel for a speedy recovery, and hopefully you will be back next week. So for folks who are just joining, we have got our wonderful guest, Rachael Wonnacott, here. I will let Rachel introduce herself in a minute or two. Just some basic housekeeping. I will be, as I mentioned, doing my very best Daniel impression. I'll be trying to moderate. We are really keen to have your calls. So the way that this webinar is going to go is in a minute or two, I will stop waffling. I will hand over to Rachel. She's going to give us an excellent presentation on the topic of your platform is not an island. And I've seen a preview and it's super. So please think about the topics that she's covering. Please think about the questions, and please feel free to add them in the kind of the Q&A if you're on LinkedIn, or post them. We will do our best. I'll do our best to keep an eye on them. I may also ask my own questions, so I'm going to just apologize for that now, but it's also a topic I care very deeply about, so I may pepper in some of my own questions as we go. So that's the general plan. Rachel will present for about 30 minutes-ish. Then we'll have time for Q&A. And if we get to the end and you haven't had your question answered, then please feel free to post them in. And what we'll do is try and do a sweep up afterwards as well. I think that's probably enough waffle from me. So just a quick introduction. I don't think I introduced myself. I'm not Daniel Bryant. My name is Paula Kennedy. I am COO and one of the founders of Syntasso. I am delighted to have Rachael Wonnacott here from Fidelity, and I will let Rachel take it away.
Great, thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here. As you've said, I'm Rachael Wonnacott, and I am now Head of Cloud Engineering at Fidelity International. But the story I'm here to talk to you about today has been long in the making with my time at Fidelity, and actually at the beginning of when I took over the role as product owner of the Kubernetes team. So there's many learnings in there, both technical and on the leadership front as well.
So hopefully we can get your slides up and get you ready to present.
That's the wrong
share
screen.
The other screen.
Can you see the Syntasso on Zenti?
Let's just check. This definitely worked in testing, right?
Worked on my laptop. I'll just reshare. Let's just turn it on and off again. We're in tech, after all.
That's the normal answer, right? Let's try again.
Let me know if you can see that now. Yeah, there we go. Lovely jubbly.
Perfect. Thank you. Take it away, Rachel.
Super. So as Paula mentioned, Today I'm going to be presenting Your Platform is Not an Island, and this journey started back in 2023, but there's also plenty of learnings from even earlier days in the days of Cloud Foundry and PaaS. So Paula and I know each other from the pivotal days, so you'll see some references there and probably some smiles from both of us as well. So a little bit of an introduction to me beyond what I've said. My name is Rachel, and I've come from a long period of platform engineering, but it wasn't always called platform engineering. So a decade of building platforms, even predating that vernacular really being popular in the industry. So PaaS, as platform as a service, for example, sort of predates that platform engineering term. And much of what we've carried into what we consider best practice for platform engineering also includes things like DevOps principles and site reliability engineering. So I really do feel like I've been fortunate that my entire career in technology has kind of led towards the lessons that I'm going to talk about today. And for context, if you're not familiar with Fidelity International, you may have heard of us. We were founded in 1969 and we operate across 27 different countries, and we're looking after just over $1 trillion of both individual and institutions money. So it's quite a large company, it's quite a large stake there, comes with a lot of responsibility, and it does mean I have the pleasure of considering engineering at scale. So I've said that your platform is not an island, but your organization is an ecosystem. And for those of you based in the UK who may have studied GCSE biology, you're probably very familiar with the following definition. So that's a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. And in your organization, I see this as analogous to your people, your various teams, and how they all fit together within your organizational structure. And to me, biology feels like a good analogy because companies typically grow organically over time, and aspects of team interaction will be subject to evolution, to get another biology analogy in there. And the question really becomes, do you survive? Now, in a startup, so the world that Paula's very familiar with, the company itself might actually just be one team. People typically wear many hats, and even as things are beginning to grow, there might not be those clear-cut team boundaries, if indeed there are any boundaries at all. While larger startups or scale-ups might start to see teams naturally emerging over time. But I believe that without conscious organizational architecture, they're very likely to line towards the technologies that the teams are responsible for. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, by the way, but I do think it can lead to unintentional silos later if that structure is not considered as things are growing. The larger the organization, simply by sheer virtue of size, the more possible combinations of teams, structures, and the harder it generally becomes to retrofit that intentional organizational design for a flourishing ecosystem, or in the case of the business, fast flow. Now, the challenges facing sort of smaller organizations versus larger organizations are really quite different. And in the realms of platform engineering, the requirement for a platform may not even exist within a startup, right? Where there could just be one full stack person wearing all of those hats. And so I wanted to be clear that this talk focuses on the ecosystems within enterprises. And in the most simple terms, when I say enterprise, what I really mean is an organization with many teams and probably many years of tenure. So with many years of tenure comes years of historical ways of working and processes. And so your ecosystem isn't really just your people and your organizational structure, it's also your processes and your maturity. So organizations that predate cloud often have structures that are influenced by on-premises infrastructure. And that kind of makes sense, right? Many of these organizations would have existed when most, if not all of the infrastructure was managed in-house and likely needed dedicated skilled teams. So you've got a combination of your technology, your skill sets, the commonly accepted working practices that probably dictated much more rigid relationships between your application teams and your infrastructure. So, as many of you probably remember, before the rise of DevOps, application teams would write the code, package it up in a little present, and throw it over the wall to operations and hope for the best. But in a world of cloud, much of these originally clear-cut team boundaries between your technologies, or let's say your layers of the stack, have kind of been brought together and blurred. So in a previous world, you could sort of be a specialist network engineer. I can relate to my early days. But in the cloud world and deploying to cloud, simply only knowing networking isn't enough, albeit it's still an essential skill. It probably also means that even if pockets of your organization have moved towards the DevOps model or the product model and aim to have self-sufficient, poly-skilled teams, there still likely exists a structure that emulates that legacy technology and enforces a variety of interaction points across those teams and across your ecosystem. And unfortunately, the more points of interaction, the more possible points for friction also. So why exactly have I taken you back through the DevOps origin story when you probably feel like you know it already, or better yet, you lived through it? Well, I wanted to remind people of a nice quote from actually 2023 now from Patrick Dubois, who is famously considered the grandfather of DevOps. He said, "Maybe now things have changed in a way that's not so clear-cut anymore. We're not dev and ops separately. Now we're more like, oh, we have 15 teams, they're all running their own stuff and they need to start collaborating. So we just shifted the complexity of frustration to that number of teams. Now, this is of course not always visible in many startups where you might only have that one team, but this becomes increasingly challenging with the vast number of teams in the enterprise. And that maybe just is the reality of DevOps at scale. So even in the perfect world where everyone moved away from those silos, we've still introduced complexity and frustration just via other mechanisms. Or similarly, within the enterprise, this is how I'm feeling telling you that DevOps doesn't work. To quote my own manager, Dean, for the third time, by the way, it's a maturity thing too. People now realize not everyone is going to be as hot at everything as was promised originally with DevOps, or it's just really expensive to do as an organization, explodes with complexity, and every team doing it their own way. I'm not sure if Dean is listening this time around, but hi, Dean, this is joyous to quote you once again. So what then is the reality within the enterprise? Well, there's actually quite a lot going on, and this certainly isn't an exhaustive list. It's just some of the things that typically come up when I have conversations with other platform owners. And as I indicated earlier, most enterprises are in some shape or form in the hybrid model of on-premises and cloud native, which means that there are always some legacy technologies in the mix and associated team structures and processes. In many cases, what this kind of means is that there are on-premises dependencies for cloud-based applications, which is typically considered to be an anti-pattern to cloud native for obvious reasons. And what that kind of leads to is overly distributed systems. Legacy processes are often themselves incongruent with modern engineering practices, which will inevitably create friction and frustration between the teams. There's also likely friction created when DevOps teams need to interact with more traditional team setups, as both sides are probably lacking the empathy to the other's way of working. And in any large institution, you probably have a large cross-section of engineering maturity across your different teams. So you're working with people at different stages of the journey. Lots of teams doing DevOps can really just mean lots of teams doing it their way, which results in duplication. But arguably, and worse than the previous points, it leads to several different ways of doing things, which can be overly complicated and quite difficult to audit, which in most cases is neither resource nor cost efficient. So why then do we want to build platforms? Well, platforms seek to solve many of the challenges that have been articulated in that previous slide, but the requirement for an internal developer platform implies multiple workloads almost by definition. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that they're of great interest to enterprises who I've said have many, many teams. Many of the reasons why organizations are choosing to build platforms are interrelated, but to simplify, I like to think about it in three personas. So on the previous slide, I mentioned that we want to reduce friction, but what or who for? And there are several layers here, these personas. So the first thing is that the business will tell you it's about delivering more frequently, at a lower cost. But then there's also the frustration of one team not reaching a certain goal or a deadline. And that's even harder to hear when there's an individual that doesn't feel they're able to effectively do their job, often because they're potentially blocked by another team. And the third layer, which maybe doesn't get quite enough focus, is that the individual has a persona here. There's simply nothing more frustrating than working really hard without results and not having an impact with the work that you do. And I think this is something quite crucial to consider, that developer experience element, if you want to retain your talent. So in many ways, platform engineering is about removing friction for the business, removing it for the groups that work on a day-to-day basis, and then also for the individual. So, as I've said, it shouldn't really be a surprise that any conversation on platform engineering often comes up with conversations on the developer experience. So it's fair to argue that while DevOps works excellently within teams, especially when you're able to manage all of your dependencies within said team, but doesn't really address the challenges of where that team sits within the ecosystem or the organization. Eventually, you will require something from another team, or the organization wants to address the duplication, the complexity, or the cost challenges that I've just articulated. And in much the same way, you need to consider where your platform sits and how it will operate within your enterprise. That is to say, your platform is not an island. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a little bit of a container platform case study. This is, as I mentioned, something that originates from 2023, but is impacted by much of the earlier work we've done in the organization. And it's quite rare to have moved through multiple teams, but still be on the same journey. So I do feel quite fortunate to be able to have that much data to reflect back on. So if you remember that cloud infrastructure basically just means somebody else's infrastructure, then we were really doing cloud all the way back in 2013. And we operated an internal cloud platform on physical tin using Cloud Foundry. And our kit really was in the basement, much like the IT crowd. And a little fun fact, when I first left my academic career to start in software engineering, my ex-physicist colleagues started to call me Jen. Please read into that as you will. Now, platform engineering has become popular, but as I mentioned right at the start, it isn't really a new concept. The PaaSes were popular over a decade ago and saw large success with open source technologies like Cloud Foundry and all the lovely work that Pivotal did to aid the developer experience with PCF, which was Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And we started out with a managed commercial offering of the PaaS, and then later migrated to operating our own fully open source platform. And this platform did really successfully reduce cognitive load and was largely pretty popular amongst our developers. But we wanted to go all in with our cloud transformation, seeking the promised cost savings of public cloud, the reduced infrastructure management responsibilities, that you get with using an IaaS. And we genuinely were inspiring to have all of our teams aligned to that same DevOps model and operating as product teams. So we needed to give those teams somewhere in the cloud to be more autonomous and take more end-to-end responsibility for those applications. So how did we go about achieving this? Well, we did this by automating the provisioning of cloud accounts that essentially were mini private data centers for each team. So each product team had their own mini data center. And to enable this in a highly regulated organization, we implemented a shared responsibility model between the workload teams and the platform team, whereby platform design, deploy, support, all of those core infrastructure services. So at that point, it was things like DNS, internet egress via a proxy, ingress to the platform, connectivity back to on-premises, lots of networking fun. And the workload team were responsible for any of those additional resources or services they deployed on top, their application code and also their configuration. But ultimately, they were really responsible for the performance and the uptime of their apps. And this also worked really well for some teams, and it's still working really well, but again, only for some teams. I mentioned earlier that large organizations likely have a large cross-section of engineering maturity and appetite, and Fidelity was no different. And what we've simply found is that one size doesn't fit all. So on screen, you have a quote directly from someone very influential in the business that I have a lot of time for. And this was part of an architecture review board when we were initially pitching the Kubernetes platform that I'm referring to. And essentially what he was saying here is he just wants to be an expert on the business logic, on the business domain, and not have to spend too much of their cognitive energy or their cognitive load budget on figuring out infrastructure. I think it's fair to say that the boom of tech and with all the new technologies coming in, AI will be no different. There's so many things for developers to keep track of that like intrinsic cognitive load and the germane cognitive load starts to take up far more than you might like from your budget to enable you to actually focus on that business delivery. So I think this is a really valid statement, although at the time it sort of challenged my very strongly held conviction on the product model being always the best way to go, but specifically within that DevOps pattern that we've started to break down at the start there. So here's me. It might not look like me. My hair is substantially different than it was back in 2018, and you might be wondering why I'm being so egregious to show you a previous version of myself at Cloud Foundry Summit Basel. But the reason I'm showing you this is that I wanted to show you that we've come full circle on our thinking. So as I mentioned, Cloud Foundry was a PaaS, a platform as a service, and Cloud Foundry's mission really, as it says on screen, was to enable the developer to only need to think about applications and data. And I had that epiphany a couple of years ago that it was very much like that quote I had on the previous slide where they really just want to think about the business logic, which ultimately is the application and the data. They want everything else managed for them, provided as a service, obfuscated. And that was fantastic, and that's why Cloud Foundry was so successful, but there were some limitations to the technology and a few grievances, I suppose, around how opinionated Cloud Foundry was as a product, although I'll come back to that later and why that's also beneficial in some areas. It also didn't really handle data-intensive applications as well as we might like for some of our use cases. So fortunately, when we were having this realization, there had been another technology gaining popularity in the community, and hopefully it will be obvious to you based on my earlier statements that that technology was Kubernetes. So this is another slide from that lovely architecture review board, and I'm not going to read you all of the detail on screen, but you can certainly squint if you want and have a little read. And what we were trying to say with this analogy was that we recognized that developers should have a choice. And that's the analogy of the hotel versus the house. And the reason that we were using that analogy is that we were trying to explain something very technical to a senior leadership audience who actually want to understand the business value and the human side and less of the technical detail. And so coming to Kubernetes was being explained much like going to a hotel where the service is provided to you. So you don't get to think about the color of your bed sheets or necessarily what's on the menu, but you get delivered a really high quality service and you enjoy the experience. Versus owning a house where you can paint your walls whatever color you want. You could even have fur on your sofa should you so desire, or you were born in the 80s. But the responsibility for looking after the house if there's a storm and the roof came up still sits with you. So what we were trying to articulate was, do you want to have everything pretty much managed for you? But that means slightly less creativity with dictated services, but then no overhead for your infrastructure. Or do you want to keep the full creativity and autonomy of public cloud, but in doing so, you need to accept the responsibility for assuring those workloads and your backend infrastructure? And as I reflect on that analogy and also on 2.5 years since we presented that and my experiences of being a product owner and progressing through leadership, I'm increasingly more convinced that there's probably something more philosophical about owning a platform in an organization that follows the MVP model. And that is that by definition, your customer won't be completely happy because it's the minimum viable product. So when I've presented at conferences, many people have asked the question, did we release our MVP too soon? And I've thought long and hard about that. And I think the reality is that no, I don't think that we did. a better way of answering that question is to say defining the minimum part of minimum viable product is always going to be the most challenging bit. So the more features that you try to predict, the more risk you build something that your teams don't actually want. But then the more minimal your MVP, the more likely your customers will see it as a motel on screen rather than the hotel that we articulated. So, you know, the customer will probably always tell you released it too soon, but maybe you can accept the definition of minimum. And more importantly, that feedback that you get potentially from dissatisfied early adopters is probably what drives the most business success, or more specifically, the best developer experience. So if you do want to be a product owner, you need to be prepared to be occasionally disliked. The lesson learned: be really so very clear with the feature definition of MVP. And while you might sell the vision or the end goal of the hotel, be really clear that version 1 might be far from it and look a little bit more like this. So I've done what any good tech leadership professional would do, and I've mapped this experience to the Gartner hype cycle. So hopefully you recognize the curve I have on screen. And I want to look through our journey through the lens of the hype cycle, as seen by our internal customers. That's our product teams, our app developers. So the first thing we had was the trigger, and that's moving away from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes. Everyone's excited, it's new skills, it's greenfield engineering, and we've got forecasted numbers that say lower costs through standardization, so leadership's delighted. And then came the inflated expectations. Kubernetes is going to solve all our app dev problems, every single one. But unlike Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes just isn't a PaaS outside of the box. And I think the technology, so Kubernetes, often gets conflated with being a platform by default. That's not true, right? It's really the control plane, and not necessarily a lot more without the add-ons or what you add to it as a platform owner. And when we compare the two, Cloud Foundry, as I mentioned, was very opinionated and tightly scoped, which made life far easier for both engineers and operators. So when we then launched our MVP, reality hit, and that brings us into the trough of disillusionment. So we realized quite quickly as a platform team, you can't offer a true PaaS without introducing complexity and blurring responsibility lines. So that was our trough. And then for the customers, they sort of realized they still needed some infrastructure knowledge. And at that time, our MVP meant that the integration with external services elsewhere in the ecosystem, so that's where the analogy comes in, were a little bit clunky. So we had to shift a little bit how we worked. We'd previously been a very self-sufficient DevOps team practicing SRE, and we weren't necessarily used to operating like a product team with customers in quite the scale that we had with the IDP, and that took a bit of adjustment. And so what was the turning point? Well, it was listening to our customers. And today, I like to think that that means that we are on the journey to enlightenment, and that's ultimately been driven by those features. So we do need to keep adding features where necessary for the platform, but we want to build towards the thinnest viable platform. So you'll notice that peak never quite gets to where that overinflated peak in terms of the expectations of the hotel. And that's where there's still a disconnect. What we define as TVP doesn't always match what our app teams expect. And honestly, that tension might never completely go away. And it's partly because the complexity wasn't always and isn't always Kubernetes, it's actually everything else around it. So I wanted to take you through the application lifecycle because this is really the premise for a lot of the conversation I'm excited to get into with Paula after I finish presenting. And it kind of shows you how we started to understand that our platform was an island, and where it sat in our ecosystem and how to break that down. So I've got a very oversimplified end-to-end process of the container part of the application lifecycle. I'm aware that's not the full SDLC, but for expedience, let's focus on the container part. It's also much more related to Kubernetes. So we've committed to using Kubernetes, right? And everyone's very excited, and we're doing this in public cloud. But we also know that there are expectations of that on-premises Cloud Foundry platform that developers are going to bring with them. And so while Kubernetes offers many benefits, it does ultimately, in its rawest form, offer a different experience to the end developer that we need to consider. Particularly, I think, as senior leadership were further away from the day-to-day, it was much easier to consider Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes like for like because they're both container orchestration products, but that didn't necessarily take into account the developer experience. So if we consider the application lifecycle to be as it is on screen, commit code, test code, build image, store image, deploy image, run image, we can nicely map what Cloud Foundry handled versus what Kubernetes does out of the box. So you can see that's what Cloud Foundry handles. This is what Kubernetes handles. A little bit different, right? And that's where there was that expectation gap. So to bring this back to the title of my presentation, as product owner for the Kubernetes platform, in some ways, if I was being really black and white about the remit of the platform, then all I'm really responsible for is running the container. But that is treating the platform in isolation or as an island and doesn't have a very strategic outlook. If I remember that the platform is not an island, I need to consider everything left in the application lifecycle and how it's going to affect onboarding to the platform and ultimately the overarching developer experience. I think it's fairly logical from an adoption perspective because it doesn't really matter how beautifully our Kubernetes runs the container if app teams are blocked or delayed in onboarding anywhere else in the lifecycle. So what challenges arose from reviewing the lifecycle? Well, we were considering what's the ecosystem we're building in. And due to our existing organizational structure at that time, many of the tools responsible for those different stages in the lifecycle were operated by different teams. And each of these different tools had quite significantly varying levels of self-service versus self-management. And given that new operating model, it kind of dictated that the Kubernetes platform was to reduce the infrastructure management requirement, like the hotel. But we also needed to consider how this would impact the operating model of everything left of Kubernetes. It became clear due to the variety of different working methodologies of those teams, but also the existing sort of interaction processes for engaging with one another, and also varying levels of self-service. It left something to be desired, let's say, for the developer, and it wasn't really a 5-star hotel service. Ultimately, developers want as smooth and consistent experience across the application lifecycle as possible, a golden path, if you will. I'm a big fan of this definition. And essentially, a smoother path can be created by reducing the number of interaction points or hops in the application lifecycle. And where there must be a variety of interactions, you can still lower the barrier to entry by standardizing the process. So that can mean lots of things. It could be standardizing the way teams expect to interact with one another by ensuring appropriate interaction modes. And I think that's really well described by the book Team Topologies, which you probably noticed that Paul and I talk about quite a lot. Fantastic book. Or more technically, it can be achieved via a dynamic configuration approach with declarative config. Most fundamentally, having a strategic shared definition across that lifecycle, and probably more likely the organization, is going to require a lot of strong leadership. So a little bit about what we've done at Fidelity. I'm coming to a close. I think most of the value is going to be Paula and I debating some of the topics. So we're going to speed along to the Q&A. You need to design alongside the entire life cycle. So at Fidelity, I was really fortunate that that road had kind of been paved by the cloud account team that I mentioned at the start, because they'd already been using the concept of pull request as an entry point and allowing product owners to make upstream requests to any of the repos owned by the platform teams. And that was pretty well socialized among our developers. This approach also adds in delivering the transparency of a distributed service that make up the platform at the back end, because you can see all of the config. So nothing is being done in an obfuscated manner. If you want to go in and take a peek, you can. And essentially what we're doing is designing along the entire life cycle. So to do this, you could take a dynamic configuration generation approach, which in this sort of oversimplified description is you've got a developer entry point simplified using declarative config. So developers will specify the desired state and then let the configuration management tool, whatever you choose to use, or in this case, the platform orchestrator, determine how to deploy it. the deployment mechanism should be transparent to the end user. They don't really care, right? They just want to get that deployment. There can be a variety of services on the platform delivered by different teams, and I'm hoping that Paul and I will talk about the database as a service example that we have, but all are presented to the customer driven by the same declarative config. So this allows us to standardize the entry point to all of our services, regardless of whether they're owned and built by the platform team or another complicated subsystem team elsewhere, if you're familiar with the team topologies lingo. We've chosen to do this using GitOps, which I would recommend. So all of the changes are driven by customer pull request. And this is also really nice within the enterprise because we can enforce a point of review or even security approval without the platform team needed to be the middle person. And this is, of course, only made possible if you can achieve an abstract description of your workload. So a really simple example, microservice of name X has dependency on database type Postgres and requires, let's say, persistent storage of 100 gig, something like this. I'm not going to spend too much detail on this, but if you have seen this from the CNCF and the Tag App Delivery Group, it's a really fantastic visualization of how this all fits together in terms of platform interfaces, capabilities, and it's something that I'll refer back to when I'm talking to Paula when we start to dissect what I mean about having lots of back-end services provided by different teams. So a quick cheat sheet, if you want to do the same thing that we did with your organization, you need to map out all of the hops that your developers need to make as part of the application lifecycle, and then map the different teams who own the services and technologies. To do that, you need to understand the different interaction expectations of all of these teams. And this could be both the process of contacting a human, but also how the technology interfaces within a system link. And I think that's going to become super important when we start to do everything agentically, probably a talk in itself. And really, you want to bring the people together. Please don't underestimate this point. It's going to take strong leadership, patience, empathy, and generally a willingness to build a life cycle for the better of the broader organization, not just your individual team. There's likely to be compromise and pragmatism. So to do this, can you sell it through the lens of the developer experience? See where it's possible to standardize those human interactions and consider how people are going to feel when you change the way that they interact with their software. Super. So there are so many things to consider that I could have spent a bit more technical detail in the weeds, but I kind of wanted to pitch the story arc and the thinking arc behind it, and I'll let Paula ask me the questions to tease out more of that technical detail. We're still very much on this journey, but I would like to leave you with the sentiment that your platform is not an island.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. I've got so many questions that I've written down, so I'm kind of trying to figure out where to start. I will also keep an eye on questions, so if anyone who is watching live or has a question, pop it in the comments, I guess, and then I will hopefully pick it up and ask. So where to start? There were so many good nuggets and pieces of advice in that talk. Thank you, Rachel. I think where I would like to start is going back to, I guess, the overarching theme, your platform is not an island, right? So you've described multiple different stakeholders that you're trying to interact with. You've talked about, obviously, using your hotel house analogy to describe concepts to business stakeholders who are not in the weeds, right? Which I like. You've also then got these different teams who maybe are contributing. You also mentioned team topologies. Like there's so many great things you talked about. In the team topologies interaction modes, I guess one of them is you begin with a high touch collaboration and then you move to X as a service. Yes. From what you're describing, it sounds like both things are true, kind of ongoing, right? Because from what I understood, your talk is like your platform is not an island. It exists in the ecosystem of your company, which is both a technical ecosystem and a people ecosystem. So you are going to have to interact with multiple teams using the different interaction modes. What I'm interested to learn is how do you reach those different personas and how do you keep on top of their requirements and you know, we've talked in the past about having that product mindset, and as a product owner, like that's key. I'm just interested in sort of top tips around when is the right time for which interaction model. How do you keep checking that your platform is continuously viable and continuously evolving, that type of work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if we want to keep it in simplest terms, there's maybe some actionable takeaways. If you consider it through the lens of what are the challenges to keeping your platform viable continuously, it's often related to changing a requirement. So, you know, the industry moves on, but also like any subsequent increasing cognitive load. So cognitive load in this case really is how many features do you have to manage, how many different tools are you using to manage those services, how many different contexts do you need to understand to make the decisions to choose the right tool for the right feature. And once you hit a certain threshold, which I felt like we hit relatively quickly because of the scale of our organization, it might happen slightly slower if you've got a more discrete use case, is around how does a small team keep all of that cognitive load at a manageable level? Now, you probably wouldn't reasonably expect a platform team to be experts in a particular niche front end part of the business. So we're financial services, right? So I wouldn't expect the platform team to be quant developers, as one example. And you wouldn't necessarily expect a platform team that's trained in containerization tooling to be as expert on databases as perhaps the data services team are. And they're just two arbitrary examples, right? One's more technical and one's more business focused. And so you need to start to consider, when can you decide, is the platform team going to provide the service better than the domain specialist? Now, to bring this back to team topologies, in the first edition, they call that the complicated subsystem team. And the only criteria for that being viable is if the complicated subsystem team can provide the service better than the platform team. Otherwise, it may as well be held within the platform team itself. Now, while it's sort of described by Matthew Emmanuel as somewhat of an anti-pattern if you need those, although it's sometimes there by necessity, in a large, complicated ecosystem like ours, they already exist. You know, that's something that you just sort of have to prepare for. And so the two interaction modes that you've mentioned is the first one, the light touch collaboration mode, which is where we come to that team and understand, okay, well, what's required of the platform? What's the delta between your domain knowledge and our knowledge? Help them understand Kubernetes so they can build the service. And then once we've figured out the interaction point, both team and technical, so interfaces or APIs typically, then you move to X as a service. So to give you a little example, our database is a service to the customer as a single entry point, like I mentioned, which is just a YAML file, of course. And when they say they want a particular database of flavor Postgres, we send an event to another pipeline, and it's a completely different pipeline owned by another team that listens for that request, and they deploy the database in a different Amazon account to ours, in fact, for blast radius reasons. But the customer gets all of the network plumbing out of the box. So that network connection and the security and the role-based access control is delivered to them as a service. So the database is just ready for them to connect to. And that for me is where we've moved from collaboration with the design towards X as a service where we're totally out of the loop.
And which makes a lot of sense. One of the things you mentioned when you were describing the difference between Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes was about opinions being baked in, right? And certainly in my past at Pivotal, we had feedback from customers saying Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and I guess Cloud Foundry in general, was highly opinionated, which has good points and bad points, right? But when you're switching to a model that Fidelity has done, which is effectively building your own internal paths, then you are responsible for putting those opinions in. So when you're trying to do this kind of house versus hotel model, are you whose responsibility is those opinions, right? How are you now taking those opinions that are not Pivotal's opinions or other PaaS provider opinions, they are the Fidelity opinions? How do you bake those into your platform?
Super hard. I would not claim to have done this perfectly, and it's an ongoing reconciliation really of expectations. So the first piece of advice is to try and be very clear from the offset what the MVP is to do. So to give us an example for everyone, like our original platform was just intended for web apps. And so we only built features that were for web apps. But then everyone heard about how great the hotel was, Win. And then we kind of became victim of our own success, where we got lots of requests for apps that weren't really suitable for our opinionated platform. And so we had to think about how are we going to scale both the complexity of the platform, but also keep a TVP, which in some ways has many overlaps in the Venn diagram with opinionated, but also enable more use cases to come on board. And so as a product owner, I think you have to have quite a lot of conviction about what thinnest means. And so you need to have an understanding of how much your team can realistically cope with, and know at what point to start leaning on maybe an enabling team model or the complicated subsystems to sort of have that multiplayer mode interaction for building out your services. But a reflection that we discussed ahead of this call, right, was changing the analogy a bit. So I think the hotel does a really good job, well, and the house, a really good job of explaining to leadership the difference between autonomy but full responsibility versus, you get a menu and you pick from the menu. But people start to kind of romanticize the hotel. And, if you go to a really nice hotel and you go down to reception and you've maybe got a bit of money and you can slide the 50 over the table, it starts to become more of a negotiation on the service. And I started to do some comparisons with IaaS providers, so Azure, GCP, Amazon, take your pick. I can't really negotiate with them over the services they provide me, so they can be opinionated, partly due to market domination. I'm going to end up using the services anyway, whereas my internal customers can slide up next to me, tap me on the shoulder and suggest that maybe we need
right?
another flavor of database. So thinking about that word flavor, I've come up with a slightly different analogy that's very popular already, but I didn't originate this analogy. It's more about self-service, and that's the vending machine. So I'm at King's Cross Station and I'm getting the train up to one of my alma maters, University of York. I'm really hungry, in a rush. Acceptance criteria here is I want crisps. Get to the vending machine and I'm really excited for prawn cocktail. It's my favorite flavor. Get there and they've only got, outrageous by the way, ready salted bacon and cheese and onion. Sorry. And so I've now got a choice. Do I still meet my acceptance criteria, which was broadly just crisps, and take a different flavor? Or do I argue with the vending machine and insist that it vends me prawn cocktail? Right, and
I don't think you're going to get much response from the vending machine, right?
Right, that's kind of where the tension exists. And so I don't want to be a really poorly, stocked. I don't want to be a poorly stocked vending machine, but I equally cannot have infinite flavors of crisps.
Makes a lot of sense. I love the term thinnest viable platform. It's funny because Abby Bangser, who's an awesome person who works in my team, she wrote a whole long blog about this once upon a time, going on quite a rant. What her rant was about specifically was people confuse the terms MVP and TVP, right? And the way Abby described it, and I'm probably going to do a really bad job of paraphrasing, her description was about MVP is sort of where you start. It's the minimum viable platform or minimum viable product of like what you're starting and when you give it to people, which you talked eloquently about. Thinnest viable platform is ongoing, right? And you're always trying to keep the platform. It's something team topologies talk about a lot. Keep the platform. What you want to avoid, and what we've seen lots of other people suffer from, is tech sprawl or platform bloat, or just continually thinking that what you want to do on your platform is add more and more features, or to your analogy, more and more things in the vending machine. And then you're ending up by overwhelming your consumers with choice. Imagine you went to the vending machine as you described, and there wasn't just 3 flavors of crisps. There were 50 different options. And you spent so long looking at all the different options of crisps that you missed your train. Like,
that could happen.
That's the kind of thing. So I'm wondering if you've got advice for how to handle the situation of, either not accepting a new request. I can imagine that's difficult, or maybe it's even harder to actually start trying to deprecate things, right? It's not always about adding things. Sometimes in your platform, you may have the case where you have to start pruning things out because it's just being used by one team and you're having to support multiple things. Have you had to do that type of work?
Yeah, so I actually have some great examples. I'm going to smile while I talk about them. If there's anyone from Fidelity watching, they might have different views, so bear that in mind. There's two elements, right? So you've spoken about the sprawl and you've spoken about deprecation, and they overlap, but they're also, they're, I guess, mutually exclusive in some ways as well. So the deprecation example is going to be a simple one, and it's a dashboard. So in the really early stages of the platform, we had a very small team, and the platform almost could have been considered a proof of concept. And so to move at pace, we just took all of the most popular add-ons from the community, i.e. if the majority of the CNCF was using a tool, we weren't going to argue with that, and we were going to be like, right, let's test this as part of our POC. We wanted our spikes to be really quick and throwaway. And Grafana's great. So Grafana is one of the tools that we had, and we had it plumbed in with Prometheus, and this is all wonderful. And what we noticed is that not all of our customers were actually using Grafana in particular, even though we felt that it was a really nice, shiny CNCF cloud native dashboard. And the root cause of that actually makes tons of sense. It's because we're in a wider ecosystem, and there's a mandated centralized tool on-prem. It's a proprietary licensed tool, right? Really good, by the way, no actual particular grievances with the tool. It's just that it's on-prem. So there was this slight anti-pattern of a cloud platform back to on-prem. But because all of our users were migrating from Cloud Foundry, they felt like they knew this tool really, really well. So for a while, we left both of these features concurrent, but essentially competing. So to bring in that thinnest viable platform piece, the cognitive load of running both solutions, given that there are only a small number of consumers over here, means we're now getting to that stage of looking to decommission that surface in the sense that we'll still use it at the back end for our dashboarding, but it's like an opt-out, right? And once that's past a certain threshold, if no one's opted in to use Grafana, it will be deprecated. Now, that was difficult for the team to stomach because it sort of felt like we were choosing a legacy tool over something nice and shiny, but it was the right decision for our customers. And it wasn't, the difference between using proprietary versus Grafana made no difference to our end customer or to our profit. So why are we quibbling over the flavor of dashboard as an example? And then in terms of keeping it thin and saying no, if anyone from leadership is watching, they'll know that I say no on a quite frequent basis. It doesn't often land, and while I often seem very confident when I say no, it is something that I struggle with as a leader. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable inside to say no. I'd much rather be liked. And the way that I do that in a minimally emotional way, i.e. remove the emotions from it, the human side, is just to talk to the customers about the business value. So if the feature request that they're asking for is really bespoke to their use case and they're one of 1,400 microservices, that's not a sufficient business case for it to be centralized in the platform. We might help them or signpost them to someone else. That means they can build up their own thing that connects or integrates with the platform, or they could inner source it and run it themselves and offer it as a service. But we only bring into the core scaffolding stuff that tries to meet 80% of our user base.
Nice. That makes perfect sense. One of the other things I wanted to dig in, we've talked a bit again about this TVP MVP thing. And I liked your when you talked about, did you release your MVP too soon? Right, go back to the MVP discussion. I find that's a really difficult thing. And working with lots of different platform teams, one pattern I've seen is where a team it's the build it and they will come mentality. And there's something about, when is the platform ready? I really loved your hype cycle as well. Like, people get very excited.
The drop of dissolution.
And then they love it, and it's never going to meet their expectations, and then it's going to sink, and then it's going to come back up again, right? But the as a product owner or platform owner, I think it must be a very difficult, scary feeling to be like, okay, the team has built something and now it's ready to be released in the world, but you always, most people kind of always have some fear that it's not quite right, or it's missing some features, etc. And then that can lead to a pattern I've seen, is that can lead to people being very reluctant to releasing anything to any if I don't get any feedback, at least I won't get any negative feedback, right? That sort of vibe. And I'm looking for like any words of advice. I mean, it's easy to tell people, just release often, release early, get early feedback, but like, what would you recommend? Is it best to work with one team as a sort of an advocate? Is it best to work with like the team that's got the hardest problem, the easiest problem? Is it better to work with like 3 teams so you get the best kind of broad feedback? Like when you're building and releasing that MVP or any new platform feature, what's in your experience the right balance of getting that feedback?
So you've mentioned a few things that sort of interlink. So particularly when you talk about how many teams maybe to interact with and is it easy or difficult. What happened was we did have a few early adopters who were, I would say, quite mature in what they were doing. And that's sort of why they became early adopters, because they were ready for the migration. It wasn't a shock to them and they were like, oh yeah, new technology. And so you can't really say whether that use case was hard or easy, because to them it was neither, in the sense that it was their bread and butter, so they were quite happy to come across. And some of those initial relationships were a bit fractious in that I was a new product owner they weren't familiar with, they didn't know me as like a leader, and you kind of become the face of the platform. Like a lot of the like feedback about Kubernetes often is feedback about me rather than the platform. And my advice there was just to sit down directly with the person and remind them that we're one team, like we're one organization, and say, yeah, tell me how it is, right? What is it that we've missed? And so there are 2 root causes that I think are good to understand, and then you can kind of try and mitigate that on the way. The first challenge is the gap in expectations. And so even though we'd never said that Kubernetes was going to exactly replicate Cloud Foundry, that's just what people assumed was going to be the case. And so certain services that we had provided on the Cloud Foundry platform, even if they weren't well consumed, by the way, like they didn't have uptake, people just assumed they would still be in the catalog. And so when we only brought across things that we felt were 80%, like I mentioned, a few of the people that were hoping for other features were disgruntled. That was slightly easier to explain away. In terms of the number of teams, I think we were lucky that we sort of had 2 key teams that were early adopters, and they really gave us lots of beneficial feedback. The only challenge I would say is that because they were more mature, at the end of the migration that we're at now, it's been a 2-year journey, some of the applications that are yet to migrate because they're the harder use cases. And it means that none of the earlier apps, even if 85% of apps have migrated, the final 15 are spaghetti, right? It's really hard to move them onto a thin, viable platform. And so their definition of thin doesn't match with ours. And so it's a leadership conversation to be, where does that cognitive load sit, right? Which is a choice. Do you want to strain the platform team by having 50 flavors of crisps so that we can have every single app in the organization on this platform? Or do you realize or come to the conclusion that there are some apps that simply aren't a great fit for a platform? And part of building a platform is making some tough decisions around standardization. And so almost by design, you shouldn't be able to fit every single application out of 100, right? If you take a clean number, you want to be looking for 80.
Yeah, good advice. I realize we're at time. I could chat to you forever, honestly, Rachel. You know I would. I'm a big fan. But we are almost at time. So I'll finish up. There was a question that Daniel asked me to ask. So
oh, lovely.
Hi,
Daniel, if he's watching.
Hi, Daniel. In the next month. So we're coming up to March. In the next month, if there's platform leaders watching this or watching the recording and they're thinking, what's the one thing they should do within their ecosystem? Because you started this off very nicely, framing it that like your platform is not an island, you're part of an ecosystem, your ecosystem being your organization, let alone the wider tech community, right? But your platform sits in your company, in your ecosystem. If there's a platform leader out there considering their own current platform, whether it's well curated, whether it's off the shelf, whether it's build your own, and there's an action that they should take to make their platform more successful in their ecosystem, what's kind of the thing that you might recommend someone could do?
There's many answers to this. I'm just going to go with my gut. I'm going to say review the onboarding process. Now, nice. In a regulated industry, it could be quite complex because you've also got things like data and compliance to think about and what you might have to evidence before onboarding the platform. Don't just think about, is the platform up and resilient? If the person can't navigate the onboarding process, it doesn't matter if the platform's really shiny, or even if the platform's mandated, people will get lost in the left, right, when I spoke about the application lifecycle. So we addressed that quite well in terms of bringing our tools team involved, bringing our security team involved, and having that all baked in. But I don't think we've fully championed automating some of like the regulatory compliance review side that is still fundamental to that onboarding process. And better yet, if you're a leader that's got some AI, or even you're a leader that still knows how to code, deploy an app yourself to your own platform, because you're only
your
really
own dog food, that thing, right?
Yeah, we're doing it at the moment actually with a dashboard. So I think our team has a bit more empathy now that we've struggled with some of the onboarding.
Nice. Amazing. Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. I love chatting to you. Thank you to all of the audience for watching, and you'll hopefully catch us on the next one. Hopefully Daniel will be better and back and do a much better job than me. But I'll just say thanks again to Rachel. Thanks to everybody, and catch you again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.